The staff at Cedar Hollow Senior Living had a name for the new administrator before he ever learned theirs. They called him the Undertaker, though never to his face, and never above a whisper. Gerald Voss had a way of walking the halls that made the air itself feel thinner, like the building was holding its breath until he passed. Then, a soft-spoken activities aide named Nora Quinn clocked in for her first shift, and within 6 weeks, the man who had terrified 200 employees would be sitting in the back of a state vehicle, watching the only kingdom he'd ever built dissolve behind tinted glass. To understand what Nora Quinn pulled off, you first have to understand how bad things had gotten at Cedar Hollow. It sat on a hill at the edge of Brindleton, Ohio, a sprawling brick facility that had opened in 1962 and had, for most of its life, been the kind of place families chose without guilt. 3 generations of the same town had aged and passed through its doors. The cafeteria still made meatloaf on Thursdays because a resident named Walter had requested it in 1987, and nobody had ever seen a reason to stop. But warmth doesn't show up on a balance sheet. And after the parent company posted 4 straight quarters of losses, the regional ownership group made a decision. They brought in Gerald Voss. Voss was not a nurse. He had never emptied a bedpan, never held a frightened hand at 3 in the morning, never sat with someone in their last hour. He had spent his career in what he liked to call distressed asset optimization, which was a polished way of saying he was hired to bleed dying businesses for whatever was left before the body went cold. He drove a silver coupe that cost more than most of his aides made in 2 years, and he wore charcoal suits that seemed to absorb the fluorescent light around him. He looked at Cedar Hollow and did not see 81 human beings in the autumn of their lives. He saw a line item. He saw overhead. He saw fat to be trimmed. His first month, he fired Dolores Reyes, the head of dietary, a woman who had worked there 26 years and knew which residents needed their food cut small and which ones got weepy if you forgot the meatloaf. He replaced her cooked-from-scratch program with shipments of frozen, reheatable trays from a vendor nobody had heard of. When a group of aides circulated a petition asking him to reconsider, Voss called the 3 women who'd signed it first into his office, one by one, and let them go for what he termed disruptive conduct. The message landed exactly the way he wanted it to. People stopped signing things. People stopped saying things. By the time autumn settled over Brindleton, Cedar Hollow ran on a current of quiet dread, and the only sound louder than the dread was the silence everyone kept to protect their paychecks. Nora Quinn arrived in the middle of October. She was 29, slight, with the kind of face people forgot in elevators. She wore her dark hair pulled back plain, kept her eyes down, and spoke so softly that the front desk had to ask her twice to spell her last name. On paper, she was an activities aide, the lowest rung on the ladder, the person who ran bingo and wheeled residents to the sunroom, and helped with crafts. She'd taken the job, she told the hiring manager, because she'd moved to Brindleton to be near her grandfather, who was slipping into the fog of dementia in a facility 1 town over, and she wanted work with predictable hours and a clear conscience. Both of those things were true. Neither of them was the whole story. What the hiring manager did not know, what nobody at Cedar Hollow knew, was that the unremarkable young woman who could barely be heard over the bingo cage had spent 6 years as a combat medic and then a flight nurse with an Army medevac unit, 2 of those years downrange. She had run trauma bays under mortar fire. She had kept men breathing in the back of a Black Hawk with one hand while radioing coordinates with the other. She had come home with a chest full of commendations she never mentioned and a quiet she'd built around herself like a wall because the loud version of her had seen too much, and she was trying, very hard, to be soft now. She wanted bingo. She wanted crafts. She wanted to wheel old men into the sun and not be anyone's last line of defense ever again. Cedar Hollow had other plans. On her first afternoon, a charge nurse named Patrice Coleman pulled her into the supply room. Patrice had 30 years in long-term care and the bone-deep exhaustion of someone watching a place she loved get hollowed out around her. "Listen to me, honey," Patrice said, keeping her voice low, even though the room was empty. "You seem sweet. You do your job, You keep your head down, and you don't ask questions about the new way of doing things. Voss is looking for reasons. He's already over the headcount he wants. Don't give him one. Nora nodded, the picture of compliance. But her eyes, in the half-second Patrice wasn't watching, moved across that supply room like a scanner. She clocked the empty shelves where wound care kits should have been. She noted the off-brand gloves, the kind that tore at the wrist. She saw that the emergency oxygen tanks had gauges reading lower than they should and a logbook that hadn't been signed in 11 days. The soft new Aide filed all of it away without changing her expression. And then she went and called bingo. And her numbers were gentle, and her smile was kind, and 3 different residents told Patrice that afternoon that they liked the quiet new girl. The rot at Cedar Hollow ran deeper than Nora's first day revealed, and it revealed plenty. 2 weeks into her time there, a memo went around from the administrative suite. Under the banner of a new efficiency initiative, Voss had restructured the overnight staffing. The old model put 1 aide and 1 nurse to roughly every 12 residents on the night shift, already thin for a population this frail. The new model stretched it to 1 nurse and 1 aide for the entire East Wing, 31 residents, many of them fall risks, several on oxygen, 2 on hospice protocols. The math wasn't difficult. It was impossible. You could not be in 31 rooms at once. You could not answer 2 call lights ringing in opposite halls. Somebody eventually was going to be alone when the worst happened. That same week, Nora found a young aide named Tyler crying in the break room. He was 22, still half a kid, and he'd been mandated to a double because someone had quit, and Voss refused to authorize agency coverage. "I had a lady on the floor for 40 minutes last night," he said, scrubbing at his face, ashamed. "Mrs. Albright. She fell going to the bathroom, and I was on the other side of the wing with somebody who couldn't breathe, and I couldn't be both places, and she laid there on the cold floor calling my name, and I couldn't get there." He looked up at Nora like he expected her to tell him it wasn't his fault, or maybe that it was. "Somebody's gonna die here, and it's gonna be on me." Nora sat down next to him. She didn't tell him it would be okay, because she didn't lie, and she'd learned a long time ago that the cruelest thing you could do to a person carrying that weight was wave it away. She just put her hand on his shoulder and let him feel the steadiness of it, the way she'd once steadied 18-year-olds in worse rooms than this. "It's not going to be on you," she said quietly. "It's on the man who built it this way. Remember that. No matter what happens, you remember whose name it's on." She'd seen this before, the slow violence of a balance sheet. In her old life, she'd watched a supply office officer ration tourniquets to hit a budget number, and she'd watched what came after. She had promised herself, in a sandblasted tent a long way from Ohio, that she would never again stand in a room where people were dying for someone else's spreadsheet and keep her mouth shut. She looked at the memo, taped to the break room wall, the cold little paragraphs of it, and somewhere behind her quiet face, the wall she'd built so carefully began, quietly, to come down. Gerald Voss thought he was playing chess with people who didn't know the rules. He had no idea he'd just put a piece on the board that had survived a war. The thing he'd built finally broke on a freezing night in November. The East Wing was running on its skeleton crew, 1 nurse, Patrice, and 1 aide, Tyler, for all 31 residents. Nora wasn't even scheduled. She'd stayed late to sit with a resident named Mr. Okafor, a retired high school history teacher with congestive heart failure, who got frightened at night and slept easier when someone read to him. She was 3 pages into a book about the Battle of Gettysburg when the call light cascade started. 2 lights, then 4, then the specific shriek of a cardiac monitor flatlining down the hall. It was Mr. Okafor's neighbor, Eleanor Hartwell, 83, recovering from a small stroke and dependent on a continuous oxygen concentrator. To save money, Voss had canceled the facility's contract with their longtime medical equipment supplier and replaced every unit with cheap machines from a company called Meridian Care Systems. The aides had complained for a month that the Meridian concentrators ran hot, that their alarms were unreliable, that twice they'd simply stopped without warning. Administration called it user error and an adjustment period. Nora was out of Mr. Okafor's chair before the alarm finished its first cycle. She hit Eleanor Hartwell's room at a dead run and took in the whole scene in under a second, the way she'd been trained to, the way that never left you. The old woman was dusky gray, lips going blue, eyes fluttering. The Meridian concentrator sat dark and silent on its cart, frozen on an error screen, the unit's own alarm dead. It had stopped pushing oxygen and never made a sound about it. There was no respiratory therapist in the building. The nearest physician was a 40-minute on-call drive away. Patrice was sprinting from the far end of the wing. Tyler was frozen in the doorway, a child again. And Nora Quinn, the soft new aide who ran bingo, dropped to her knees beside the bed and became, in an instant, the person she'd spent 2 years trying to bury. Tyler, crash cart, hallway now. Patrice, call 911, then get me the portable O2 and a bag valve mask. Her voice had changed. It was low and flat and absolute, a voice that did not allow for panic in a room, and both of them moved before they'd decided to. She had the dead machine disconnected and was reading the carotid pulse with fingers and timing it against her own breath. She cleared the airway, got the mask sealed, and started squeezing oxygen into Eleanor Hartwell's lungs in a rhythm so even you could have set a clock by it, counting under her breath, watching the chest rise, adjusting, watching, adjusting. For 9 minutes, she ran that resuscitation like she'd never left the war. When the paramedics finally banged through the wing doors, they found a patient with a pulse and an open airway, and a young woman in an activities aid polo calling out a clean, precise report, rate and rhythm and timeline, that made the lead medic look at her twice and ask, flatly, "Where'd you train?" Nora didn't answer. She handed off, stepped back, and let her hands shake only after they couldn't see. Patrice saw, though. Patrice had been watching the whole time, and Patrice was no fool. "Honey," she said quietly, in the wreckage of the room after the ambulance pulled away, "you're not an activities aide." Nora pulled her wall back up where she could. "I used to do something else," she said. "It doesn't matter what. What matters is that machine should have screamed bloody murder and it didn't, and that woman is alive on a coin flip because I happen to be in the building off the clock. Tomorrow night, nobody's off the clock. Tomorrow night, she's just dead." She looked at the dark Meridian unit on its cart, and Gerald Voss is going to stand up in that town hall on Friday and tell us all how much money he saved. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at her grandfather's old kitchen table, and she made a different kind of plan than the one Voss thought he was playing. Every quarter, Gerald Voss held a mandatory all-staff meeting in the Cedar Hollow community room, where he stood at a podium and walked everyone through his numbers like a coach reviewing game film. It was less a meeting than a sermon, and the congregation was not permitted to talk back. That Friday morning, the room was packed, nurses and aides and kitchen staff in folding chairs, all of them tired, all of them silent. Voss stood under the lights in his charcoal suit, a projector throwing his savings figures across the wall behind him. "As you can see," he said, smooth as oil, "by streamlining our staffing model and optimizing our vendor relationships, Cedar Hollow has cut operating costs 18% this quarter. We are, for the first time in 3 years, on track to profitability." He let a small smile sit on his face. "Any questions before we wrap up?" It was rhetorical. It was always rhetorical. Nobody ever asked Gerald Voss a question. In the fourth row, Nora Quinn stood up. She was still in her crumpled polo from a double shift, and in her arms she carried something heavy and square, wrapped in a pillowcase. The room went so still you could hear the projector fan. Patrice, 2 seats down, went pale and shaped a silent no with her mouth. Nora didn't look at her. She walked up the center aisle, the squeak of her sneakers the only sound in the world, climbed the 2 steps to the little stage, and set the bundle on the podium beside the microphone. Voss's smile curdled. "Excuse me, this is a closed staff briefing. Return to your seat." Nora pulled the pillowcase away. It was the dead Meridian concentrator from Eleanor Hartwell's room, still frozen on its error screen. "My name is Nora Quinn," she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried the flat command of someone used to being heard in rooms full of chaos. 3 nights ago, this optimized piece of equipment shut off the oxygen to a resident recovering from a stroke. Its alarm failed. Nobody was assigned to that wing closely enough to hear because of the staffing model on the slide behind you. Eleanor Hartwell is alive because I was in the building off the clock. By luck. By nothing else. A sound went through the room like wind through grass. Aides looked at each other. Nobody had ever spoken to Gerald Voss this way. His face went red. Miss Quinn, this is wildly inappropriate. If you have an equipment concern, you file a maintenance ticket. You do not hijack an all-staff meeting. You are jeopardizing your employment. I'm jeopardizing nothing compared to what you're jeopardizing, Nora said, and now she turned slightly, so she was speaking to the room as much as to him. Your 1-31 overnight model violates the state's minimum staffing standards for skilled nursing. This equipment comes from a company that didn't exist 2 years ago and does not meet federal reliability standards for life-sustaining oxygen delivery. You're not trimming fat, Mr. Voss. You're cutting into bone, and you're billing these families full price while you do it. Voss leaned toward the microphone, and the threat in his voice was meant only for her. You're fired, Quinn. I'll have you walked out. Nora didn't blink. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick brown envelope and set it on top of the broken machine. Inside that envelope are the equipment logs from that night, signed by myself and Nurse Coleman. There are also written statements from 9 other employees documenting near-fatal failures of these exact Meridian units over the past month. Copies are already in the hands of the state, long-term care ombudsman, and the health reporter at the Columbus Dispatch. The room came apart. Months of held breath let go all at once into a rush of murmurs and gasps. And Gerald Voss, looking down at that envelope, went the color of old paper. He understood in that instant that the soft little Aide he'd never bothered to learn the name of was not throwing a tantrum. She was a threat, calm and complete, and aimed directly at the heart of everything he'd built. Nora turned her back on him, left the dead machine and the envelope on his podium, and walked out the way she'd come, spine straight, sneakers squeaking. She had broken the spell of his power in front of every soul who'd been afraid of him. But she knew, pushing through the community room doors into the gray morning, that this wasn't the end. A cornered man with everything to lose is the most dangerous kind, and Gerald Voss was about to come back swinging. By noon, she was unemployed, walked to the parking lot by a security guard named Earl who paused at her car, glanced back at the building, and said quietly, "Bravest thing I've seen in this place in 20 years. Miss Quinn." Then he tipped his cap and went back inside. Nora didn't go home to cry. She drove straight to the office of a retired plaintiff's attorney named Harold Brennan, a man who had once owed her late father a debt he'd never had the chance to repay. Back inside Cedar Hollow, Voss moved fast to contain the fire. He understood that Nora's defiance was a match dropped in dry grass, and he meant to stamp it out before the whole staff went up. His first move was Patrice Coleman, whose name was on those logs. He summoned her to his office, a corner suite with leather chairs and a view of the hills, while the residents' day room had water stains on the ceiling. "Patrice," he said, not looking up from his desk, letting the silence stretch. 30 years here. Full pension in 18 months. It would be a shame if an internal review found that you falsified a clinical record on the night in question. That kind of finding follows a license. Ends a career. Ends a pension. He slid a typed statement across the desk, one that blamed the oxygen failure on operator error by a now-terminated Aide, and laid a pen beside it. "Or you sign this, and we forget the whole thing, and you retire next year with my blessing." Patrice looked at the pen for a long moment. She thought about 18 months. She thought about her knees, her husband's medical bills, the pension she'd given 30 years to earn. Her hand drifted toward the pen. The office door opened without a knock. Tyler stood in it, the 22-year-old kid, white-knuckled but standing his ground. "Patrice, Mr. Okafor's asking for you. He's worked up. Won't settle for anybody but you." He looked at Voss, then back at her, and his voice steadied. "A resident needs you. Let the paperwork wait." Patrice dropped the pen like it had burned her. She stood, said nothing to Voss, and walked out behind the boy. In the stairwell, she put her back against the cinder block and breathed. He's going to come after my license, she whispered. No, he isn't, Tyler said, and he sounded surprised by his own certainty. Because we're not doing this alone anymore. Not since she stood up. Voss had fired Nora, thinking he'd cut out the infection. He hadn't understood that what she'd left behind wasn't a person. It was a contagion of nerve. That night, Patrice started what the staff came to call the Quinn book. In the basement records room, mostly abandoned since the place went digital, inside a dusty cabinet, mislabeled 1996, linen in Inveci, she set a thick black binder. Word moved through the building the way it always had, through the cooks and the janitors and the night aides. Every Meridian unit that glitched got logged. Every call light that rang past 20 minutes because the wing was too thin got logged. Every fall, every missed med pass, every bruise photographed on a personal phone and printed at home went into the book. While they gathered the evidence inside, Nora was building something larger outside. She sat across a sticky table in a diner off Route 9 from a woman named Marie Delgado, the veteran health and corruption reporter for the Columbus Dispatch, a cynical, sharp-eyed bulldog who Zul spent her career turning over rocks in the long-term care industry. I read your statement, Marie said, tapping her coffee mug. It's ugly. He's a creep, no argument. But corner cutting in a nursing home isn't a front-page story. That's just the industry. To get the Attorney General and the feds to come down on a place, I need more than cruelty. I need a crime. Nora slid a folder across the table. Before I was a medic, she said, I did a year in supply procurement. I know how to read a vendor chain. Inside were photocopies of Cedar Hollow's purchase orders for Meridian Care Systems. Voss says he switched to Meridian because they were the low bidder. But look at the corporate address. It's a mail drop in Delaware. My lawyer and I spent 3 days in state incorporation records. Meridian Care Systems is a wholly owned subsidiary of a holding company called Ashbury Equity Partners. Marie's eyes sharpened. Ashbury. Why do I know that name? Because Gerald Voss was a founding partner at Ashbury before he came here, Nora said, and something old and cold moved behind her eyes. He didn't switch to cheaper equipment to save Cedar Hollow money. He switched to equipment from a company he secretly owns a stake in. He's running the facility's budget through his own pocket, buying defective machines from himself, billing Medicaid and Medicare full freight while these residents stop breathing in the dark. It isn't negligence, Marie. It's federal healthcare fraud and an illegal self-dealing kickback scheme. Marie closed the folder slowly, and something predatory came into her face. Give me 72 hours. I'm going to take this man apart. The hammer came down on a sleeting Thursday, 3 weeks to the day after Nora Quinn was walked out the front doors. At 5 a.m, the Columbus Dispatch published Marie Delgado's investigation online. The Undertaker's Ledger, Cedar Hollow Administrator, tied to shell firms supplying faulty life support gear. The piece laid out the whole self-dealing scheme, backed by purchase orders and incorporation filings, and quotes from Nora and a wall of anonymous staff. By 6:15, Voss's phone was rattling off the nightstand, with calls from the ownership group, his lawyers, his investors. He threw on a suit and drove his silver coupe towards Cedar Hollow with one plan in his head, to get to the equipment and the records before anyone else did. He was too late. At 6:30, a line of state vehicles and 2 unmarked sedans pulled up to the front entrance. A joint task force, investigators from the Ohio Department of Health, the Long-Term Care Ombudsman's Office, and 2 agents from the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Unit walked through the doors. Voss came sprinting into the lobby at 6:45, tie crooked, breathing hard, and got on his phone to the maintenance lead. Marvin, listen to me. Take your whole crew to the East Wing and surgical recovery right now. Pull every Meridian concentrator, box them, move them to the loading dock. If anybody asks, it's a manufacturer recall. Do it now. He rode the elevator up, intending to oversee the purge himself. When the doors slid open, he stopped cold. The hallway was blocked. Shoulder to shoulder across the corridor stood a wall of Cedar Hollow staff, nurses and aides, and 2 cooks still in their aprons. At the center stood Patrice Coleman, arms crossed. Behind her, Tyler held the thick black Quinn book against his chest like a shield. Move, Voss said, stepping out. You're interfering with a recall. Move or you're all terminated. Nobody moved. The fear that had run this building for half a year was simply gone, burned off, replaced by something harder and quieter and immovable. There's no recall, Mr. Voss, Patrice said, her voice carrying down the linoleum. And you don't have the power to fire anybody anymore. Under federal whistleblower protection, every employee here cooperating with an active investigation is shielded from retaliation. You can't touch us. What investigation? Voss spat, going gray. This one's, said a deep voice behind him. He spun. Out of the stairwell came the two FBI agents and the lead state health investigator, and behind them, holding a visitor's badge, calm as still water, stood Nora Quinn. Gerald Voss, the lead agent said, drawing a folded warrant from his coat. We have a federal warrant to seize all administrative records, financial documents, and medical equipment in this facility, and a warrant for your arrest on charges of healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and reckless endangerment. Whatever was left of his composure went out of him all at once. He looked at the agents, then at the wall of his own staff, then at the soft, forgettable young woman he had never once bothered to see clearly. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. You can't do this, he finally managed, hollow as the cuffs came out. I saved this place. I balanced the books. You balanced them with people's lives, Nora said, stepping forward until she was right in front of him, close enough that he had to look at her, really look, for the first time. She watched the cuffs click shut around his wrists. Now you settle the account. They walked him out through the corridor, and his staff parted to let him pass, and there was no cheering, no jeering, only the heavy, clean quiet of a long siege finally lifting. Tyler handed the black binder to the investigators, hundreds of pages of meticulous proof of everything Gerald Voss had done in the dark. By that afternoon, the ownership group had fired him in absentia and issued a flailing public apology. Desperate to save the facility's name, they reached out to Dolores Reyes, the dietary director Voss had fired in his first month, and begged her to come back as interim administrator. Dolores accepted on 3 conditions: full transparency, an immediate return to safe state-mandated staffing, and real equipment that worked. They agreed to all 3 before she finished the sentence. Late that day, Dolores found Nora in the East Wing, quietly helping Patrice sort the chaos the raid had left behind. Miss Quinn, she said. The board's authorized me to offer you Director of Resident Care, corner office, real salary, standing to make sure this never happens again. Nora looked down the hall where the steady, reliable hum of proper oxygen concentrators had already replaced the silence. She looked at Patrice, at Tyler crossing the corridor with a meal tray, at Mr. Okafor waving at her from his doorway. Then she picked up a fresh activity schedule and a deck of bingo cards. Thank you, she said, but I belong out here. Somebody's got to make sure the people in the corner offices actually do their jobs. The halls of Cedar Hollow don't run on fear anymore. Nora Quinn never took the management job. She still calls bingo on Tuesday afternoons, still reads to Mr. Okafor when the nights get long, still keeps her old life folded up, quiet inside her, where almost nobody can see it. She proved a thing that everyone in that building already knew in their bones, but had been too afraid to say. The administrators may hold the budget, but it's the people at the bedside who hold the power. A place like Cedar Hollow isn't measured in margins. It's measured in who's willing to stand in the hallway and refuse to move.